Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you enjoy quiet journeys through the gentle corridors of history, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like to share a little moment with us, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're setting off for a rather quiet, often overlooked corner of Western Europe. Belgium. A small country by landmass, yet a remarkably layered patchwork of peoples, languages, and landscapes. In many ways, Belgium is not a nation forged in fire or thunder, but in meetings, margins, and middling terrain. It is a country where borders whisper more than roar, where the pulse of history is more often felt in the market square than on the battlefield. The history of Belgium is not defined by the rise and fall of great empires, but rather by its position perpetually between things, between France and Germany, between Latin and Germanic worlds, between Catholic tradition and secular modernity. Belgium, in its quiet resilience, has often absorbed the energy of greater powers around it, reshaping itself to endure. But before it became Belgium, this land was simply the Low Country. Damp fields, gentle rivers, and soft hills shaped the rhythm of life here for centuries. Ancient tribes roamed its open spaces, Roman legions stamped their authority into the soil, and later medieval cities would bloom from the profits of wool, cloth, and careful trade. Through the centuries, these lands would belong to many, yet never quite belong fully to any. There is something enduringly modest about the story of Belgium. Its past is not always grand or heroic, but it is deeply textured and quietly human. It tells of patient craftsmanship, of multilingual coexistence, of stoic endurance through occupation and war. And at the heart of it all, a people shaped not by singular triumphs, but by the quiet persistence of identity. So, if you're ready, I invite you to settle in, breathe deeply, and join me as we drift gently through the long, subtle story of Belgium, a place of crossroads, compromise, and quiet continuity. Let us begin, not with cities or kings, but with the land itself. Low, flat, and softly green, where rivers trickle slowly toward the sea and fog settles thick in the morning air. Long before the name Belgium was ever spoken, these lands lay nestled between the salt-brushed coastlines of the North Sea and the deep forests of what would one day be Germany. It was a place shaped as much by water as by earth. Marshy in places, sandy in others, and threaded with meandering rivers like the Scheldt and the Meuse, which formed quiet arteries of movement long before roads were cut. In this early time, what we often call prehistory, though it was a history of its own kind, small groups of people lived close to the land. They fished, they hunted, and they began, slowly, to sow. As the Neolithic period arrived in the region, agriculture took root. The soil, though not always rich, yielded barley and wheat. People began to shape tools from polished stone, then bronze, then iron. And in the forested uplands of what is now Wallonia, burial mounds still whisper of long-forgotten lives, gently mounded over by time. By the Iron Age, this part of Europe was home to Celtic-speaking peoples, though we should be careful not to picture them as a single tribe. They were many, and they were varied. The Belgi, after whom Belgium would eventually be named, were one such group, not a single tribe, but a confederation of them, loosely knit and often quarrelling. Julius Caesar, writing with the clarity of one who wished to conquer, described them as the bravest of the Gauls, though such praise was perhaps a tactical compliment meant to justify Rome's hard-handed approach. The Belgae lived in fortified hilltop settlements called oppida. though less grand than their southern cousins in Gaul. Their homes were simple, thatched with reed, and their economies were local, rooted in trade, farming, and seasonal rhythms. Cattle were wealth, and iron tools were valuable. They did not write their history, so what we know comes through the eyes of outsiders, and so much is lost between the lines. But these people were not primitive in the sense we might imagine. They forged intricate metalwork, navigated trade routes that stretched into Britain and beyond, and built social networks defined by both kinship and allegiance. There were druids here too, it's believed, those shadowy priests of the Celtic world who kept law, and ritual alive without written words. Their ceremonies, now obscured by centuries of silence, would have marked the seasons with reverence, fire, and song. The forests in those days were vast. Much of modern Belgium would have been wooded, dense with oak and beech. Wolves and bears still roamed freely, and human settlements clung to the edges of the clearings, where fields could be carved out from the undergrowth. Life was not easy, but it followed an ancient cadence: birth, toil, gathering, rest. Around the 1st century BCE, the world began to change. Rumors of Roman expansion filtered northward, stories of legions, of roads that stretched across lands like threads, of coins and columns, of laws spoken in Latin. For the tribes of the Belgi, this was an ominous echo. Some prepared for war, others saw opportunity in alliance. Julius Caesar's campaigns into Gaul eventually brought him to these lands. In 57 BCE, he launched what would become the Roman conquest of Belgic Gaul. The resistance was spirited but scattered. At the Battle of the Sabes, or the River Sambre as we now know it, Caesar claimed a decisive victory over the Nervi, a powerful Belgic tribe. He wrote of their courage, their surprise attacks, their narrow defences. Yet Roman arms prevailed, and in the decades that followed, this region was folded into the empire's northwestern edge. With the Roman conquest came new rhythms. Roads appeared where there had been paths. Bridges crossed rivers that once had to be forded, and towns began to take shape in stone. But this quiet moment, this early chapter, belonged still to the tribes, to the misty forests and cold rivers, to the people whose names we know only from second-hand lists. Even as Roman influence crept in, the spirit of the Belgi endured for some time. Their villages remained, their customs quietly persisted, and their relationship to the land continued, deeply rooted and largely unchanged. History often glances over this period, favouring empire over obscurity, but there is something quietly enduring about those centuries before conquest, a time of patient continuity, where life unfolded not in great events, but in the steady passing of seasons. And so, in this first chapter of Belgium's long story, we begin not with a bang, but with a whisper, of wind through trees, of stone tools on flint, of quiet people in a quiet land, living lives that, though distant, echo still in the soil beneath modern feet. As the legions advanced and the frontiers of the Roman Empire crept ever northward, the lowlands of modern-day Belgium slowly shifted from tribal strongholds into imperial borderlands. With the conquest largely complete by the middle of the 1st century BCE, these lands were reorganized into a Roman province known as Gallia Belgica. It was not a dramatic transformation at first. No great palaces rose overnight, nor did the local people immediately abandon their ways, but rather a gradual overlaying of Roman structures upon native foundations. The Romans were, above all, administrators. Once the sword had cleared the way, the surveyor's rod and the bureaucrat's pen followed. Roads were surveyed and paved with remarkable precision. Military camps, some temporary, others more permanent, dotted the region, each designed to project order as much as strength. And alongside these outposts, new settlements began to take shape. Not grand cities necessarily, but small urban centres known as vici, places where Roman soldiers retired, merchants gathered, and provincial officials kept a watchful eye. One of the most notable of these early towns was Tongeren, known then as Aquatuca Tungrorum. It became the administrative heart of Roman Belgium and bore the usual marks of Roman civic life. There was a forum, of course, the open public space that served as both market and meeting place. There were baths, fed by aqueducts or heated with hypocaust systems, and temples where Roman gods mingled quietly with native deities. Latin inscriptions appeared on stone altars, and Roman law began to replace tribal custom. Yet, Romanization was rarely a swift or total affair. In rural areas especially, life carried on much as before. Small farms, villae rustici, spread across the countryside, run by local elites who had come to see cooperation with Rome as the surest path to stability. These estates were modest at first, built from timber and daub, but over time many would be rebuilt in stone, with tiled roofs and geometric mosaics beneath their feet. Even so, the rhythms of the land remained: ploughing, sowing, harvest, rest. The Roman presence also brought new technologies and practices. Pottery, once local and coarse, became standardized and fired in larger kilns. Amphorae arrived from southern Gaul and beyond, carrying wine, olive oil, and other luxuries previously unknown to many. Coins circulated more widely, stamped with imperial profiles and Latin legends, facilitating trade and serving as subtle reminders of Rome's far-reaching authority. There was, however, always a military undercurrent to Roman rule here. Belgium sat near the empire's northern frontier, a liminal zone known as the Limes. The Rhine River marked the official boundary, but the real frontier was more porous. Garrisons were stationed along key routes, and forts were periodically reinforced. In times of peace, soldiers contributed to local economies, marrying local women and settling into provincial life. But in times of unrest, these same soldiers could be called upon to put down revolts or repel incursions. One such revolt took place in the year 69 CE, the Batavian Rebellion. Though centered further east, its tremors were felt throughout the region. Discontent with taxation, conscription, and heavy-handed Roman administration boiled over into violence. The legions eventually restored order, but the episode was a reminder that imperial peace was never absolute. Beneath the veneer of Roman order, older loyalties and resentments still smouldered. Despite occasional unrest, Roman Belgium generally prospered in the first few centuries of imperial rule. The Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace, brought with it a measure of security that allowed trade, agriculture, and culture to flourish. Towns like Bavae, Bagacum Nerviorum, and Arlon, Orolonum, grew modestly, connected by a well-maintained network of roads that linked the region to the wider Roman world. Travellers could make their way from these lowlands to the heart of the empire in Rome, or westward to the bustling ports of Gaul, all along stone-laid paths lined with milestones and way stations. Religion, too, reflected this blending of worlds. Traditional Roman gods such as Jupiter and Minerva found homes here, but they often coexisted with local deities. Shrines dedicated to forest spirits, healing springs, and mother goddesses continued to draw worshippers. The imperial cult, the veneration of the emperor as a divine figure, was promoted in public life, especially in urban centers, though how deeply it penetrated rural consciousness is difficult to say. By the 3rd century, however, the calm began to fray. The Roman Empire entered a period of internal crisis and external pressure, often referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. Germanic tribes such as the Franks and Alemanni began to press more aggressively along the Rhine, and the imperial defences in Belgium became increasingly strained. Raids and instability grew more common. Some towns declined or were partially abandoned. Others fortified their walls or relocated entirely. In response to these pressures, the empire restructured itself. The province of Gallia Belgica was eventually divided, and a more militarized administration took hold. Larger forts were constructed, and military commanders gained more political power. Civilians increasingly sought refuge in defensible locations, and the old balance between Roman order and local life began to shift. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, began to take root in this region by the 4th century. Though evidence is sparse, archaeological finds suggest small Christian communities had emerged in towns like Tongeren by the late Roman period. Quietly, a new spiritual current was beginning to flow through these lands, one that would outlast the empire itself. As the 5th century approached, the Roman hold on Belgium weakened. Legions were withdrawn to deal with more urgent threats elsewhere. The roads decayed, the administrative centres faltered, and the imperial presence grew faint. Local elites began to assert more autonomy, and Germanic tribes once held at bay began to settle more permanently. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the late 5th century, it did so not with a single fall, but with a gradual fading. In Belgium, Roman rule did not end in fire, but in a slow retreat. The eagle standards disappearing one by one from provincial capitals, the tax collectors no longer arriving, the Latin inscriptions ceasing to multiply. And yet, the Roman imprint remained, in the roads that still trace the countryside, in the ruins of villas and baths, and in the memory of a time when law and stone stretched from the lowlands all the way to the Mediterranean shore. As the 5th century drew on, and the last flickers of Roman administration dimmed in the Low Countries, the lands that would one day be called Belgium entered a quieter, less illuminated chapter. There are fewer records, fewer written words to guide us, and much of what we know comes piecemeal, through fragments of law codes, archaeological layers, and later chronicles that peer backward with the hazy uncertainty of hindsight. It was a time of transition, of quiet unravelling and tentative new beginnings. The legions were gone, the civic buildings left to moss and silence, and Roman coinage grew scarcer with each passing season. Yet life did not stop. The soil still required tilling, livestock still needed tending, and people continued to live, to marry, to die, just as they always had. Into this space stepped a new people, the Franks. A Germanic confederation of tribes, the Franks had long existed on the edges of the Roman world, sometimes as allies, sometimes as raiders, often as both. By the late 5th century, they were no longer content to skirt the empire's borders. With little resistance left, they began to settle the land more permanently, first in the northern regions, near what is now Flanders, and gradually spreading further inland. Clovis, the Merovingian king, is often remembered as the unifier of the Franks. Around the year 496, he famously converted to Christianity, adopting the Roman Catholic faith rather than the Arian Christianity practiced by many other Germanic tribes. This decision, subtle though it may seem, had profound consequences. It placed the Frankish kingdom in alignment with the Gallo-Roman bishops and gave it a legitimacy that few other post-Roman realms could claim. But the Frankish world was not centralized. Not yet. It was a patchwork of local leaders, tribal loyalties, and shifting boundaries. The landscape of early medieval Belgium reflected this. In the north, Germanic influence was strongest, both linguistically and culturally. In the south, especially in the former Roman towns of Tongeren and Aalen, Latin persisted a little longer, and the memory of Roman order lingered faintly in the minds of the clergy. The countryside was dotted with wooden churches and stone chapels, often built atop earlier Roman sites. Christianity had begun to spread, carried by missionaries and monks who wandered from settlement to settlement, baptizing villagers, erecting crosses, and translating scripture into local tongues. One such figure was Saint Amand, a 7th century missionary who travelled through Flanders and the Scheldt Valley, founding monasteries and preaching to the local people. His efforts, and those of his contemporaries, gradually transformed the religious landscape from one of syncretic belief to more orthodox Christian practice. Yet despite this growing spiritual unity, political authority remained diffuse. The Merovingians ruled in name, but local lords, comites and duces, exercised real power. These early medieval magnates controlled estates, raised levies, and served as intermediaries between king and peasant. Their manors became centres of both economic and judicial life, where disputes were settled, grain stored, and tithes collected. Most people lived in small hamlets or isolated farms, their lives shaped by the turning of the seasons. Fields were worked using wooden ploughs pulled by oxen. Rye, barley, and oats were the staple crops, and sheep provided both wool and meat. Homes were built from timber and thatch, with a central hearth for warmth and cooking. It was a modest existence, no luxuries, little safety, but a slow continuity that bound generations together. In the 8th century, a new dynasty began to rise. The Carolingians, named after Charles Martel, eventually supplanted the Merovingians, and their influence would stretch deeply into the Belgian lands. Charlemagne, the most famous of their line, ruled from Aachen, just east of present-day Belgium, and considered these lands well within his imperial orbit. Under his reign, the empire expanded, education was promoted, and a rudimentary form of governance took shape. The Carolingian system divided land into counties, each overseen by a count appointed by the emperor. Monasteries and bishoprics were granted privileges, and scriptoria writing workshops began to copy texts and preserve classical knowledge. At the Abbey of Saint-Hubert in the Ardennes, and the Abbey of Saint-Bavon in Ghent, monks laboured over vellum by candlelight, preserving both sacred scripture and remnants of Roman wisdom. Yet even under Carolingian rule, the land was not unified in a modern sense. Local dialects flourished, regional identities remained strong, and the influence of the crown was often felt only indirectly. Authority was personal, not institutional, and much depended on the charisma and strength of individual lords. By the 9th century, new threats emerged from the sea. Viking raids, sporadic at first, became more frequent along the North Sea coast. The flat terrain of Flanders offered little defence, and monastic communities, with their silver chalices and illuminated manuscripts, were tempting targets. Towns like Ghent and Bruges were plundered, and rivers like the Scheldt provided easy inland access. The Frankish response was inconsistent, and many coastal settlements were left to fend for themselves. Over time, however, these raids subsided. Some Norse settlers even established permanent holdings, integrating into local society and contributing to the complex tapestry of Belgian ancestry. By the end of the 9th century, political authority once again fragmented. The Carolingian Empire splintered after the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and Belgium found itself at the crossroads of new realms, divided between West Francia and the Middle Kingdoms, between the ancestors of modern France and those of Germany. And so, Belgium remained what it had always been, a land between languages, between cultures, between kingdoms. It was neither fully Latin nor fully Germanic, neither wholly North nor wholly South, but in that in-betweenness, a quiet resilience took root. Towns began to grow again, markets re-emerged, local rulers carved out stable territories that would form the seeds of the medieval counties to come. It was a patchwork, to be sure, uneven, loosely stitched and prone to fray, but it was enduring. And in its slow rhythms, in the sowing of fields, the tolling of monastic bells, the measured prayers of cloistered monks, a new chapter of Belgian life was taking shape beneath the surface, under the soft weight of time. As the 10th century dawned and feudal Europe took shape, the lands that now form Belgium began to stir with a quiet but steady energy. The chaos of earlier centuries gave way, not to peace exactly, but to a measure of stability, enough for life to root itself more deeply and for something remarkable to begin, the slow rise of cities. The soil remained as it always had been, hard in places, damp in others, and stubbornly inconsistent. But the people had adapted to it with age-old pragmatism. Agricultural improvements, such as the heavy plough and the three-field system, began to yield more consistent harvests. The surplus was small, but it was enough to support more people, enough to feed not just farmers, but those who did not till the land, weavers, smiths, merchants, and scribes. Out of this modest surplus, urban life began to re-emerge, not in the grand style of Roman cities, but in new, more organic forms. Settlements gathered at crossroads, by riverbanks, and near castles. Markets appeared where traders exchanged grain for cloth, salt for cheese, iron tools for hides. Over time, these trading points grew into towns, and towns into cities. In Flanders, low, flat, and threaded with rivers, this transformation was most pronounced. Towns such as Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres began to thrive. Their growth was not fueled by gold or conquest, but by wool. English wool in particular, shipped across the Channel and woven into fine cloth by Flemish hands. It was this cloth that became the foundation of urban prosperity in medieval Belgium. The cloth industry was intricate. Raw wool arrived in great bales, often coarse and oily. It had to be washed, carded, spun into thread, and then woven on looms that clacked and hummed in workshops and homes. The finished cloth was dyed, pressed, and finally sent off to market. This work was not glamorous, but it was steady, and it drew people into the cities. Craftsmen, apprentices, traders, and the ever-growing class of merchants. With commerce came organization. Guilds formed to protect trades and regulate standards. There were guilds for weavers, fullers, dyers, tanners, and tailors, each with its own rules, rights, and hierarchy. Membership was often inherited or earned through years of apprenticeship, and guilds served not just economic but social and spiritual functions. They held festivals, supported widows, and funded chapels. As towns grew wealthier, their citizens began to seek greater autonomy. In an age where most people were subjects of feudal lords, urban dwellers, bourgeois as they came to be known, pushed for charters that granted them freedoms, the right to hold markets, elect councils, and govern themselves within their walls. In some cities, these charters were won through patient negotiation. In others, through protest or even open revolt. Bruges, with its canals and merchant houses, became a centre of international trade. Its markets drew buyers from across Europe, and its port connected Flanders to the North Sea and beyond. Ghent, by contrast, was a manufacturing powerhouse, its population among the largest in northern Europe during the 13th century, and Ypres, while smaller, was renowned for the quality of its textiles. These cities were not peaceful havens, but they were vibrant. Narrow streets bustled with carts and criers. Bells rang out from churches and belfries, marking the hours of prayer and work. Markets thrived in open squares where fishmongers, bakers and potters set up their stalls. Life was crowded, often dirty, and full of noise, but also full of purpose. And in the midst of this urban energy stood the church. Cathedrals rose slowly, stone by stone, their spires reaching skyward. They were financed not just by kings or bishops, but often by the townspeople themselves through donations, taxes, and guild endowments. The church remained the spiritual heart of medieval life, but in the cities of Belgium it shared space with commerce and civic pride. Education, too, found a foothold. Schools were established under the auspices of cathedral chapters. Latin remained the language of learning, but the seeds of vernacular literature began to sprout. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Middle Dutch texts appeared. Simple poems, religious stories, practical manuals, marking the beginning of a written culture rooted in local language. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The success of the towns was not always welcomed by the nobility, whose authority was often challenged by rising urban power. Conflicts erupted, sometimes violent, between patrician families, merchant guilds, and noble overlords. One such episode occurred in Bruges in 1302, when tensions between French forces and Flemish townspeople led to the infamous Battle of the Golden Spurs. Though celebrated in later centuries, at the time it was simply another in a long line of clashes over autonomy and control. Still, the cities endured. They built walls, not just for protection, but as statements of identity. Within those walls, they nurtured a culture that was neither fully feudal nor fully modern, but something in between. A culture shaped by trade, by craft, by shared purpose. In the southern regions, Wallonia and the Ardennes, the urban story was less pronounced, but not absent. Towns like Namur and Liège also grew, supported by trade along the Meuse and the presence of ecclesiastical power. Liège, in particular, became a bishopric of note, its churchmen wielding both spiritual and temporal authority. By the end of the 14th century, the outlines of modern Belgium's urban fabric were in place. The cities of Flanders and Brabant had established themselves not just as centres of trade, but as symbols of civic independence and resilience. Their streets bore the marks of prosperity, yes, but also of struggle, of negotiation, of the quiet assertion of identity. In these cities, one sees the roots of Belgium's later character. not a land dominated by a single centre, but a constellation of towns, each with its own voice, its own rhythm, its own pride. A country born not in royal courts or ancient epics, but in the sound of looms, the murmur of markets, and the enduring hum of ordinary life. By the 15th century, the medieval cities of the Low Countries were no longer simply outposts of trade and craft. They had become the economic jewels of northern Europe. Yet with growing wealth came new entanglements, as cities and regions were drawn into the complex web of dynastic ambition that shaped late medieval Europe. It was a time of elaborate titles, of marriages sealed with entire territories, and of rulers who governed not from within, but from above. In this way, Belgium, as it was not yet called, came to fall under the banners of Burgundy, and later of the Habsburgs. The story begins with the Duchy of Burgundy, a realm centred in eastern France, but extending far into the Low Countries through inheritance and alliance. In 1369, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy and son of the French king, married Margaret of Flanders, the heiress to a vast collection of counties and duchies in the Low Countries. This union set in motion a slow political consolidation, drawing regions such as Flanders, Brabant, Hainaut and Namur into what became known as the Burgundian Netherlands. Under the Burgundian dukes, particularly Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, these territories were administered as a single, though still fragmented, political entity. The aim was centralization, not only of administration, but of identity. A sense of Netherlandish unity was encouraged, even if only loosely realized. The dukes ruled from cities like Brussels, Ghent and Mechelen, establishing elaborate courts and patronizing the arts with quiet intensity. Philip the Good, who reigned from 1419 to 1467, presided over a period of relative peace and cultural flourishing. His court was among the most splendid in Europe, drawing artists, poets and philosophers. The painter Jan van Eyck, often associated with the refinement of oil painting techniques, worked in his service. Lavish manuscripts were produced, richly illuminated and bound in velvet and gold. The dukes saw themselves not just as rulers, but as stewards of civilization. Yet their rule was not without resistance. The cities of Flanders and Brabant, proud of their ancient liberties and guild traditions, were not always amenable to Burgundian centralization. Urban revolts were not uncommon, and concessions had to be granted to maintain a delicate balance between princely authority and civic autonomy. It was a quiet, ongoing negotiation, sometimes in stone charters, sometimes in tense silences. Charles the Bold, the last of the main Burgundian line, sought to transform his scattered territories into a coherent kingdom. His ambition was vast, perhaps too vast, and he pursued military campaigns that ended in his death at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. His only child, Mary of Burgundy, inherited his lands, but not his strength of position. Faced with internal unrest and the threat of French expansion, Mary married Maximilian of Austria, a member of the powerful Habsburg family. This marriage, while practical, had far-reaching consequences. It brought the Burgundian Netherlands under the influence of the Habsburg dynasty, a house whose reach would soon span from Iberia to the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. The Habsburg inheritance passed next to Charles V, grandson of Maximilian and Mary. Born in Ghent in 1500, Charles was a native of the Low Countries, though his responsibilities soon extended far beyond them. As Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, he presided over a vast and unwieldy empire. yet he retained a particular attachment to his Netherlandish subjects, whom he regarded with a blend of affection and authority. Under Charles V, the administration of the Low Countries became more systematic. The 17 provinces, ranging from modern Belgium to parts of the Netherlands and northern France, were formally recognized as a single unit under Habsburg rule. The emperor convened the States General, a representative assembly, though its power remained advisory. Religious uniformity became a pressing concern during this time, as the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe. Charles, a devout Catholic, sought to suppress heresy in his domains. In the Low Countries, this meant the introduction of inquisitorial measures and the persecution of Protestant preachers and their followers. The cities, long accustomed to local autonomy, chafed under these decrees. And yet daily life continued. Markets remained busy, ships came and went from Antwerp's bustling port, and guilds maintained their rhythms. Antwerp, in particular, became one of Europe's most important commercial centres during the 16th century, surpassing even Bruges. It was a city of bankers, printers, spice merchants and map makers, its streets alive with the quiet rustle of ledgers and the scent of ink and cinnamon. In the countryside, the manorial system began to soften. Tenant farmers, though still tied to local lords, found increasing freedom through contracts and rents rather than feudal obligations. Windmills turned slowly on the horizon, and churches anchored village life with their bells and baptisms. The world was changing, but not all at once. When Charles V abdicated in 1555, he divided his empire, giving the Spanish crown, and with it the Low Countries, to his son, Philip II. This transition would mark the end of relative calm. Philip, raised in Spain and steeped in Catholic orthodoxy, viewed the Netherlands more as a possession than a homeland. His efforts to impose religious conformity and centralized authority would spark decades of resistance, a story to be told in time. But for now, in the waning light of the Habsburg dusk, Belgium's lands lay under a quiet patchwork of ducal ambition and imperial design. The cities were prosperous, the countryside stable, and the people lived not in fear, but in a watchful state of negotiation, balancing local custom against princely command, faith against doubt, and the familiar rhythms of daily life against the slow, unfolding movements of history. By the middle of the 16th century, the Low Countries had grown into a vibrant corner of Europe, commercially prosperous, culturally rich, and deeply urbanized. Antwerp stood at the centre of international finance and trade, its quays crowded with goods from every part of the known world. The countryside, while quieter, was no less productive, dotted with prosperous villages and gently turning mills. And yet, beneath this surface of order and affluence, tensions were rising. The old balance between local liberties and central authority, between tolerance and uniformity, had grown fragile. At the heart of these tensions was religion. The Protestant Reformation, sparked in 1517 by Martin Luther's theses in Wittenberg, had spread swiftly across Europe. By the 1520s and 30s, its influence had reached the Low Countries. Lutheranism was the first to arrive, followed by Anabaptism and later Calvinism. These movements found fertile ground in the cities, particularly among craftsmen, merchants, and educated urbanites who were drawn to their message of direct access to scripture, moral reform, and resistance to clerical corruption. The authorities, however, did not welcome this spiritual diversity. Charles V had already issued harsh edicts against heresy, and under his successor, Philip II of Spain, the policy became even more rigid. Philip, a devout Catholic and an absolute monarch in temperament, saw religious dissent as a threat to both the church and the crown. He sent Spanish officials to enforce doctrine, expanded the powers of the Inquisition, and introduced new bishoprics designed to increase royal control over the church. To many in the Low Countries, this was not merely a religious matter. It was a political affront, a challenge to local privileges, traditions, and autonomy. The cities, which had long enjoyed self-governance in matters of taxation and internal order, viewed the centralization of authority with deep suspicion. The nobility, too, felt sidelined by the growing influence of Spanish administrators. In 1566, discontent burst into the open. A group of lesser nobles, styling themselves the Compromise of Nobles, petitioned the regent, Margaret of Parma, Philip's half-sister, to ease the persecution of Protestants. Though their demands were initially dismissed, they set off a chain of events that would unravel imperial control. In August of that year, bands of iconoclasts swept through the Low Countries, destroying religious images in churches and monasteries. This Beeldenstorm, or iconoclastic fury, shocked Catholic Europe and enraged Philip II. His response was swift and uncompromising. He dispatched the Duke of Alba, a hardened general, to restore order by force. Alba arrived in 1567 with a large army and established the Council of Troubles, known colloquially as the Blood Council. Hundreds were executed, including prominent nobles such as the Counts of Egmont and Horn. Thousands more fled into exile. Alba's repression was effective in the short term, but it fueled deeper resentment and laid the groundwork for prolonged resistance. What followed was a long and complex conflict, the 80 Years' War. Beginning as a rebellion against Spanish rule, it gradually evolved into a broader struggle for religious freedom and political independence. The northern provinces, led by figures such as William of Orange, eventually broke away to form what would become the Dutch Republic. The southern provinces, encompassing most of present-day Belgium, remained under Spanish control, but not without conflict. In the early years of the war, the entire region was engulfed in instability. Cities shifted allegiance, fortresses changed hands, and religious tensions flared into violence. Calvinist governments were briefly established in Ghent and other Flemish cities, only to be crushed by royalist forces. The Spanish military campaign was brutal, and towns like Antwerp suffered greatly. In 1576, the city endured a horrific sack at the hands of mutinous Spanish troops, a massacre that left deep scars. Yet amid the turmoil, something enduring took shape. In 1579, the southern provinces signed the Union of Arras, pledging loyalty to the Spanish crown and reaffirming Catholicism as the state religion. A year later, the northern provinces responded with the Union of Utrecht, forming the basis of an independent Dutch state. The division, though not final at the time, would eventually harden into a lasting political and cultural boundary. The southern Netherlands, from which Belgium would later emerge, became a bastion of the Counter-Reformation. Under the guidance of the Jesuits and other Catholic orders, churches were restored, new schools were founded, and religious life was re-centered around confession, devotion, and sacrament. Art, too, played a role. Painters like Peter Paul Rubens infused their work with religious grandeur and emotional intensity, reflecting the renewed fervor of Catholic identity. Spanish control, though reasserted, was never quite absolute. The provinces retained a degree of local autonomy, and the old civic traditions, guilds, magistrates, councils, continued to function. Yet the war dragged on, with periods of renewed fighting well into the early 17th century. Only in 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, was the conflict formally concluded. The northern Netherlands were recognized as independent. The southern provinces remained under Habsburg rule. In the end, the Reformation left Belgium divided, not only from the Netherlands to the north, but also within itself. While Catholicism became dominant, Protestant communities persisted quietly in places, often practicing in secrecy or migrating elsewhere. The war had devastated cities, disrupted trade, and strained the economy. Antwerp, once the leading commercial hub of Europe, saw its port decline as trade shifted northward to Amsterdam. Yet the southern Netherlands endured, its cities rebuilt, its people, wearied by war, resumed their crafts and customs. The rhythm of daily life, of market days, church bells, and seasonal fairs, resumed with a kind of patient determination. And through it all, Belgium's characteristic quietness remained. Not the quiet of submission, but of resilience, the slow, steady reconstruction of a society after fire, shaped as much by faith as by pragmatism. As the 17th century unfolded, the southern provinces of the Netherlands, corresponding closely with modern-day Belgium, settled into life under the long shadow of Spanish rule. Though the roar of battle had quietened with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the landscape was not left unchanged. The wounds of war were slow to heal, and what remained was a land defined as much by what it had lost as by what it still possessed. The Spanish Habsburgs, while victorious in retaining these provinces, governed from afar. The court in Madrid had little direct understanding of local conditions, relying instead on governors-general and a cautious bureaucracy to maintain order. These governors, usually high-ranking nobles or members of the extended Habsburg family, resided in Brussels, a city which by then had become the de facto administrative centre of the southern Netherlands. The balance between central authority and local governance was carefully managed. The provincial estates, assemblies of nobles, clergy, and burghers still played a role in taxation and legislation, though increasingly their influence was overshadowed by the dictates of Madrid. Local traditions, civic privileges, and religious orthodoxy were all upheld, so long as they did not interfere with broader imperial aims. What defined this era above all was a mood of cautious recovery. The great cities of the south, though no longer at the peak of their commercial power, remained active centres of industry and craftsmanship. Antwerp, for all its diminished trade, retained a quiet dignity, its guilds still weaving, printing, and smithing with patient hands. Ghent and Bruges, once fierce in their autonomy, softened into more provincial rhythms, their canals slow-moving, their markets less frantic than before. In this quieter climate, the Catholic Church continued its work of renewal. The Counter-Reformation, having taken root in the previous century, now bore fruit in the form of parish stability, educational institutions, and religious orders. The Jesuits, in particular, were active in founding colleges and shaping spiritual life. Churches were richly decorated with Baroque altarpieces, gilded woodwork, and soft flickering candles, spaces designed not just for worship, but for emotional immersion. Art and architecture remained vital threads in the cultural fabric. Rubens, though by then gone, had left a legacy that shaped generations. His pupils, his style, and his grand visions persisted. Canvases filled with saints, martyrs, and celestial light adorned churches and convents alike. Music, too, found expression in sacred compositions, gentle polyphonies that filled chapels and cloisters with measured reverence. In rural areas, life was slower still. villages remained closely tied to the seasons, to the harvest, and to the parish priest. Fields were tilled much as they had been for centuries. Land was passed down through families, and local fairs offered brief moments of excitement amid the routine of sowing and reaping. The calendar revolved around saints' days, planting cycles, and the occasional arrival of a tax collector or travelling merchant. Politically, the southern Netherlands occupied an ambiguous place in Europe. Situated between France and the growing Dutch Republic, it was a buffer, a passageway, and often a pawn. The Treaty of Westphalia had not only divided the Low Countries, but had left the south exposed to geopolitical jostling. The Spanish crown's entanglements in wider European conflicts frequently drew these provinces into wars not of their own making. During the latter half of the 17th century, the shadow of France grew longer. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, sought to expand French territory and influence. His ambitions led to multiple incursions into the southern Netherlands, sometimes framed as defensive measures, sometimes openly aggressive. The region became a theatre for the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, and the 9 Years' War, with fortresses built and rebuilt and troops marching across familiar fields. These conflicts, while not as devastating as the earlier revolts, strained resources and disrupted trade. Towns like Mons, Tournai, and Namur changed hands more than once. Sieges became almost seasonal events, and the fortifications of Engineer Vauban, star-shaped, stone-ringed, and meticulously measured, became common sights along the borderlands. Despite these interruptions, daily life persisted. Markets opened, weddings were held, and bells continued to ring. There was a kind of resignation in the air, not despair, but a quiet endurance. The people of the southern Netherlands had grown used to larger powers determining their fate. Their focus turned inward to the rhythms of home, hearth, and harvest. The economy, while modest, remained diversified. Agriculture provided stability, especially in the fertile regions of Flanders and Brabant. Artisanal production continued, particularly in textiles, lace, and metalwork. Lace-making in particular became a hallmark of Belgian craftsmanship, delicate, intricate, and prized across Europe. Women played a central role in this industry, working from home or in small workshops, their nimble fingers creating patterns passed down through generations. Education and learning, nurtured by the church, maintained a quiet presence. The University of Leuven, founded in the 15th century, continued to serve as a centre of Catholic scholarship. Latin remained the language of learning, and theology, philosophy, and law were its chief disciplines. Outside these formal institutions, literacy was slowly spreading, aided by the availability of printed devotional materials and almanacs. As the century turned and the Spanish Habsburgs gave way to the Austrian line in the early 18th century, the southern Netherlands changed rulers once more, yet again without direct say in the matter. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713 to end the War of the Spanish Succession, transferred the territory from Spain to Austria. The shift was legalistic and largely administrative. For most people, life went on unchanged. Looking back, this Spanish period, spanning nearly 150 years, was not a golden age, nor a time of rapid transformation. Rather, it was a time of endurance, of quiet persistence under foreign rule. Its significance lies not in conquest or rebellion, but in continuity. The unbroken thread of village life, of civic pride in diminished cities, of a Catholic faith woven gently through daily routines. It was a subdued chapter in the story of Belgium, but not a hollow one. It taught the value of survival, of compromise, and of cultural preservation. And as foreign banners flew over its fortresses and foreign tongues echoed in its courts, the people of the southern Netherlands continued, quietly and patiently, to live as they always had, on the edge of empires, in the soft heart of Europe, beneath the long, unchanging sky. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the relative quiet of the Austrian Netherlands, what we now think of as Belgium, was stirred once again by the winds of change. This time, they blew from the south, across the wooded borderlands, and into the hearts of the Low Countries. France, long a looming presence, was itself undergoing transformation. Revolution had broken out in 1789, shaking the foundations of monarchy, church, and tradition. And like ripples on a pond, those shocks soon reached Belgian soil. At first, the Austrian Habsburgs attempted reform. Emperor Joseph II, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, had sought to modernize governance, reduce the power of the clergy, and centralize administration. Yet his reforms were met not with gratitude, but resistance. The Belgians, both conservative and proud of their local privileges, bristled at such abrupt interference. In 1789, a brief and somewhat improbable rebellion flared, the Brabant Revolution. It declared the United Belgian States a fragile confederation inspired by both medieval precedent and revolutionary ambition. But it was short-lived. Austrian troops returned in 1790, restoring order. The idea of independence, however, had been planted, and it was not long before a more radical force arrived, one not interested in negotiation or compromise. By 1794, revolutionary France had turned outward, determined to spread its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. French armies swept into the Austrian Netherlands, defeating imperial forces and occupying the territory. The French Republic annexed the region, absorbing it directly into the expanding nation. The Belgian provinces were no longer separate duchies and counties, but departments, newly named, reorganized, and governed from Paris. The transition was abrupt. The old privileges of the church, the nobility, and the guilds were swept away. Feudal dues were abolished, religious orders suppressed, and monasteries emptied of their quiet inhabitants. Church bells fell silent in many towns, and statues of saints were removed or hidden. The revolutionary calendar was introduced, with its 10-day weeks and new secular festivals. Latin was replaced by French in official matters, and conscription into the French army became mandatory. For many Belgians, especially in the countryside, these changes were deeply unsettling. The traditional rhythms of life, rooted in feast days, parish routines, and local autonomy, were disrupted. Resistance took quiet forms. Priests continued to celebrate Mass in secret. Communities held on to forbidden symbols, and many fled across borders to escape persecution or conscription. And yet, amid this upheaval, not all was destruction. The revolutionary regime introduced civil marriage, uniform legal codes, and a new sense of citizenship. Roads and infrastructure were improved to serve the needs of the army, but these also benefited commerce and communication. Trade was redirected, not without friction, toward France, and many urban centres adjusted to new administrative systems with a measure of reluctant adaptability. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, first as first consul, then as emperor. His rule brought order to the chaos of the revolution, but it was a highly disciplined order, centralized, militarized, and intensely pragmatic. Belgium, still annexed, remained under French control. its cities now part of the Napoleonic world. The Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804, reshaped legal life. It replaced a patchwork of feudal laws with a coherent system grounded in equality before the law, property rights, and secular governance. The code remains influential in Belgian law to this day. Education, too, was reorganized, with new schools established under state supervision, though they lacked the spiritual elements of their predecessors. Brussels, Ghent, and other cities became hubs for French administration. French became the dominant language of government and prestige, a shift that would echo into Belgium's later identity struggles. The countryside, meanwhile, endured continued conscription, heavy taxation, and occasional shortages, all intensified by the demands of France's endless wars. Resistance to French rule simmered but rarely boiled over. Some Belgians served in Napoleon's armies, others in the administration. Many simply endured. The village remained the axis of daily life. Crops still needed planting, markets still opened, and families found small joys amidst the weight of empire. Bells eventually rang again. The church regained a cautious place in public life after Napoleon's concordat with the Pope in 1801, though it remained under close scrutiny. By the early 1810s, the tide was turning. Napoleon's campaigns in Spain and Russia had drained France's strength. As Allied forces pushed westward, Belgian cities once again became strategic outposts. In 1814, the French withdrew. The Austrians did not return. Instead, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Europe's victorious powers redrew the map. Their solution for Belgium was practical, if somewhat artificial. It would be merged with the northern Netherlands to form the United Kingdom of the Netherlands under King William I. The aim was to create a strong buffer state against future French aggression, but the union was uneasy from the start. Still, the French period had left its mark. For some, it was remembered as a time of oppression, for others of progress. It had disrupted old orders, introduced new ideas, and shifted the cultural and political trajectory of the region. The Belgian people, shaped by centuries of foreign rule, had once again absorbed change with quiet tenacity. Their cities bore the architectural remains of revolution and empire. Their laws, the imprint of Napoleonic clarity, their memories, a blend of resistance and reluctant adaptation. And so, as the dust of empire settled, the people of Belgium found themselves once more in a new political arrangement, neither fully Dutch nor entirely foreign, but something in between. The story of Belgium, always balanced between greater powers, continued, not with fanfare, but with the steady persistence of those accustomed to waiting, to watching, and to quietly preserving their own ways beneath the ever-shifting banners above. The year was 1815. The Congress of Vienna, that long and deliberative gathering of diplomats and monarchs, had concluded. Its decisions, meant to ensure stability after the upheavals of the Napoleonic Wars, were pragmatic rather than poetic. Among them was the unification of the northern and southern Netherlands into a single state, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was not a union born of shared identity or mutual desire, but one drawn in careful ink lines on a map, a geopolitical solution to keep France in check. At its head stood King William I from the House of Orange-Nassau. He was a stern and industrious monarch, shaped by exile and war, with a belief in strong central authority. His kingdom now stretched from the North Sea to the Ardennes, encompassing two very different regions. The north, largely Dutch-speaking, Protestant and commercially maritime, was now joined to the south, a land of Catholic faith, French and Dutch dialects, deep-rooted guilds, and distinct legal traditions. From the outset, the union was uneasy. The king, though not without vision, governed with a heavy hand. He imposed Dutch as the official language in Flanders, where many were still more at ease with French or local dialects. He centralized education, commerce, and administration, often in ways that seemed to favor the north. Catholic bishops, long cautious of state interference, viewed his reforms with deep suspicion, and the bourgeois elites of the southern cities, proud of their autonomy and traditions, grew resentful of what they perceived as a northern imposition. Economically, there were successes. The South, with its burgeoning industries, especially in textiles and coal, benefited from state investment in infrastructure. Canals were dug, roads improved, and trade encouraged. The city of Liège became a centre of steel production. Yet these benefits were not enough to overcome the sense of cultural and political imbalance. Socially, the rift widened. In the South, Catholics found themselves a religious minority in a Protestant-led state. Though freedom of worship was guaranteed, public life and education increasingly reflected Protestant norms. The liberal Catholic middle class, who had hoped for more representation, felt sidelined. Meanwhile, language policy alienated both Francophones in Wallonia and Flemish speakers accustomed to local autonomy. Political participation was limited. The king ruled in a paternalistic manner, often bypassing the legislature. Petitions were submitted, grievances aired, but little changed. Discontent simmered quietly through the 1820s, in editorial columns, private conversations, and occasional protests. The press, though censored, began to nurture a shared Southern consciousness, subtly voicing the sense of being governed by a distant and uncomprehending authority. And then, in 1830, something shifted. It began with a performance, an opera in Brussels, La Muette de Portici, a dramatic tale of revolt against tyranny. The audience, stirred by its themes, spilled into the streets. What followed was not carefully planned, but erupted spontaneously. Protests turned into riots. Riots swelled into revolution. Local militia defected, and government buildings were seized. The unrest spread rapidly from Brussels to Liège, to Ghent, to Antwerp. Within weeks, the southern provinces had effectively broken away. Though at first the revolutionaries declared only the desire for autonomy, the momentum soon favoured full independence. A provisional government was formed, and in October 1830 it declared the establishment of an independent Belgian state. King William I attempted to restore order by force. Dutch troops briefly re-entered Brussels, but resistance was fierce and international pressure mounted. By 1831, the major European powers recognized Belgium's independence, reluctantly, cautiously, but definitively. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a German prince with British ties, was invited to become king. He accepted, and on 21st July 1831, he took the oath as Leopold I, the first king of the Belgians. The new country, though small, was complex. It inherited the southern Netherlands' patchwork of languages, customs, and regions. French was adopted as the language of government, despite the majority of the population speaking Dutch dialects or regional tongues. This decision, born of elite preference, would fuel linguistic tensions that simmered throughout the coming decades. Belgium's early years were fragile. The threat of Dutch invasion loomed for several more years, and only with the 1839 Treaty of London did the Netherlands formally recognize Belgian independence. Even then, the border between the two remained a subtle scar, a reminder of a forced union that never took root. Yet the Belgians proved quietly industrious. A constitution was drawn up, liberal in spirit, guaranteeing freedoms of religion, press, and association. A parliamentary system was established, and though voting rights were restricted to property-owning men, it laid the groundwork for later reform. The Catholic Church, having weathered the storm of revolution, regained its influence, particularly in education and social affairs. Industry flourished. The Sillen Industrielle, a belt of coal and steel production stretching from Mons to Liège, became the heart of Belgium's economic growth. Railways were built, the first on the continent, linking cities and enabling trade. Textile mills spun steadily in Ghent and Verviers. Glass and porcelain works dotted the landscape. Belgium, though newly formed, moved with quiet determination into the modern age. Still, old divides remained. The linguistic split between Dutch-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia began to take political shape. The countryside, mostly Catholic and conservative, often differed from the more liberal urban centres. And while the constitution promised unity, the experience of most citizens remained local, shaped more by parish and province than by national sentiment. But there was something distinctly Belgian taking form, a blend of pragmatism and perseverance, of plurality and coexistence. It was not a nation built on grand myths or martial glory, but on negotiation, compromise, and a shared desire to be governed at home, not from afar. By mid-century, Belgium stood as a quiet anomaly in Europe, a small, independent constitutional monarchy nestled between great powers. It had no empire, yet, no dominant culture, no single identity. But it had endured revolution, resisted foreign rule, and begun to chart its own cautious course. In the towns and cities, life settled. Markets resumed their gentle bustle, schools opened, church bells rang in familiar cadence, and though the memory of Dutch rule remained sharp in some quarters, it gradually softened, like all memories do, into something quieter. A lesson, perhaps, in the dangers of union without consent, and the enduring strength of a people's quiet desire to shape their own lives. As Belgium moved further into the 19th century, it began to settle into the contours of its new identity, not with grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but through the slow, patient construction of institutions, industries, and everyday routines. The early decades of independence were cautious ones, shaped by the quiet resolve of a small nation finding its footing in a continent of empires and shifting alliances. King Leopold I, the newly crowned monarch, was no stranger to diplomacy. A German-born prince with close familial ties to the British crown, he brought with him a sense of calm pragmatism. Though foreign by birth, he understood the fragile patchwork of Belgium's political and cultural landscape. His role was not to dominate, but to stabilize. To be, as he was often described, a constitutional king who reigned but did not rule. The Belgian Constitution of 1831, progressive for its time, enshrined a parliamentary monarchy, civil liberties, and the separation of powers. It was a document designed not for spectacle, but for endurance. The Chamber of Representatives and the Senate formed the legislative core, though suffrage was tightly limited to wealthy male property owners. Over time, this narrow base would gradually widen, but for the moment, governance remained the domain of a small, educated elite. Religion remained central. The Catholic Church, deeply woven into the daily lives of Belgians, regained much of its pre-revolutionary influence. Education in particular became a site of quiet contest. Catholic and secular liberals vied for control of schools, each seeing them as the seedbeds of the nation's future. This tension would simmer for generations, shaping politics and policy in subtle but persistent ways. Economically, Belgium moved with quiet energy into the industrial age. The country possessed the natural ingredients for early industrialization: coal in Wallonia, iron ore in the hills, and an existing network of craft traditions and urban trade. Under the careful guidance of statesmen such as Charles Rogier, railways were expanded, factories constructed, and canals modernized. By the 1850s, the Sillon Industriel, a stretch of industrial activity running from Mons through Charleroi to Liège, had become the engine of Belgian growth. Coal mines echoed with the sound of picks and pulleys. Ironworks flared and hissed. Workers, men, women, and children, toiled for long hours in difficult conditions, their lives shaped by the steady rhythm of labour and the soft promise of wages. Flanders, by contrast, remained more agricultural, more traditional, and for much of the century, poorer. Many rural communities struggled with overpopulation, limited arable land, and a slower transition to industrial life. Flemish towns and villages clung to older patterns: lace-making, small-scale weaving, and seasonal migration to wealthier areas. The linguistic and economic divide between Wallonia and Flanders, never absent, became more pronounced during this period. Yet Belgium remained cohesive, bound by shared institutions and a growing sense of national pride. The monarchy served as a unifying symbol, not grandiose, but steady. National holidays were observed, coins minted, postage stamps printed. The black, yellow, and red tricolour became a familiar sight on government buildings and in town squares. A quiet civic identity took root, not loud or doctrinaire, but firm in its preference for self-rule, stability, and measured progress. In foreign affairs, Belgium maintained a posture of neutrality. This principle, guaranteed by the Treaty of London in 1839, was not only a diplomatic safeguard, but a reflection of the country's character. Surrounded by larger powers, France, Germany, and Britain, Belgium chose not to assert itself on the global stage, but to focus inward, on development, education, and gradual reform. Still, it was not a static country. Political debates continued, often between Catholic conservatives and liberal reformers. The so-called school wars of the mid-19th century, disputes over the control and funding of education, highlighted the depth of feeling around religion, modernity, and the shape of Belgian life. These conflicts were not marked by violence, but by petitions, newspaper editorials, and parliamentary motions. A reflection of a political culture that favoured process over passion. In literature, history, and the arts, Belgians began to reflect on their past and imagine their future. The works of writers like Hendrik Conscience, who wrote in Dutch and celebrated Flemish identity, helped to elevate the language and culture of the North. Slowly, the imbalance between French and Dutch began to be acknowledged, though equality was still some way off. Meanwhile, science and innovation found fertile ground. The University of Leuven, the Free University of Brussels, and other institutions fostered research in engineering, medicine, and the humanities. Belgian cartographers, botanists, and chemists contributed to international knowledge, often quietly, without fanfare. Through the second half of the century, urban life expanded. Cities grew denser, their skylines shaped by smokestacks and spires alike. Public parks were laid out. Gas lighting illuminated cobbled streets. Railway stations, with their iron canopies and stone facades, became the new cathedrals of movement and connection. Life was changing, slowly but unmistakably. Yet the country remained deeply stratified. The industrial workforce labored under conditions that were often harsh, with limited rights and protections. Social reform would come only later, pressed for by workers' movements and cautious politicians alike. For now, the structure held, supported by a belief in order, progress, and the importance of gradualism. By the time Leopold I died in 1865, Belgium had transformed. It was no longer the hesitant state born of revolution, nor the nervous buffer crafted by foreign hands. It had become a functioning constitutional monarchy with a distinct identity, a modest industrial power, and a quiet confidence in its own path. His successor, Leopold II, would bring with him new ambitions of overseas empire and global prestige, but that story, with its shadows and complexities, would unfold in time. For now, Belgium stood as a country that had, through negotiation, compromise, and resilience, made itself. In its towns and cities, its parishes and schools, its factories and fields, Belgium had become not just a collection of provinces, but a nation. Not loud or triumphalist, but enduring, a kingdom of its own. As the 19th century turned its final corner, Belgium stood quietly among the European nations, industrialized, constitutional, and diplomatically neutral. Its cities hummed with commerce, its countryside with steady labor. Yet beneath this modest exterior, new ambitions were taking shape. They belonged chiefly to one man, Leopold II, the second king of the Belgians. Where his father had been cautious and constitutional, Leopold was restless and driven, his gaze turning not inward but outward toward empire. Leopold ascended the throne in 1865 with a clear sense of purpose. He believed that Belgium, though small, deserved a place on the world stage. With most of Europe's colonies already spoken for, he sought an unclaimed realm, one that might bring wealth, prestige, and influence. It was not an idea widely shared by his government, which remained hesitant and focused on domestic matters. And so, Leopold pursued his goal as a private venture. The opportunity came in Central Africa. In the 1870s, Leopold funded expeditions under the guise of humanitarian and scientific enterprise. The most notable of these was led by Henry Morton Stanley, a British-American explorer who charted the Congo River basin. With Stanley's help, Leopold secured treaties, many of them questionable in their legitimacy, with local leaders, presenting them as voluntary agreements. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, the European powers formally recognized Leopold's claim to the Congo Free State. It was not a Belgian colony, but a personal possession of the king. At first, the project was cloaked in benevolence. The Congo Free State was presented as a civilizing mission, a place where slavery would be ended, infrastructure built, and African lives uplifted. The Belgian public, for the most part, accepted this narrative. Few questioned the details, and fewer still travelled to see them firsthand. In schools and newspapers, the Congo was depicted as a source of honour and potential, far removed from everyday Belgian life. But the reality was far harsher. The Congo Free State became a site of brutal exploitation. Its economy revolved around ivory and increasingly rubber, harvested from wild vines by forced labor. Local communities were coerced into production quotas. Punishments for failure were severe. Whippings, hostage-taking, and amputations were among the documented abuses. Entire regions were depopulated through violence, starvation, and disease. The administrative system was minimal. A small number of European officials, backed by private companies and armed force publique troops, exercised near-total control. Villages were often governed through fear. Resistance was crushed, and few avenues existed for appeal. The profits, meanwhile, flowed steadily into Leopold's coffers. He financed grand construction projects in Belgium, wide boulevards, monuments, and public buildings, funded in part by Congolese labour and suffering. By the late 1890s, reports of these abuses began to surface. Missionaries, travellers, and African voices themselves documented what was happening. Their testimonies reached Europe through pamphlets, lectures, and eventually international campaigns. The most prominent critic was the British consul Roger Casement, whose 1904 report laid bare the extent of the atrocities. Writers such as E.D. Morel and Mark Twain joined the chorus of condemnation, and the Congo Reform Association emerged to pressure the Belgian state and the international community. Leopold resisted. He denied wrongdoing and mounted an aggressive public relations campaign. Yet the evidence was overwhelming and the moral pressure difficult to ignore. In 1908, under growing political and international pressure, the Belgian parliament assumed control of the territory. The Congo Free State was dissolved and replaced with the Belgian Congo, a formal colony under the Belgian government. The transition marked an end to Leopold's personal rule, but not an end to inequality. The Belgian Congo, though better administered, remained a deeply segregated and hierarchical society. Education for Africans was limited, often provided by missionaries rather than the state. Political representation was non-existent. Belgians lived in separate quarters, governed their own affairs, and viewed the Congolese as subjects, not citizens. Economically, the colony remained valuable. Copper, palm oil, and rubber continued to be extracted in large quantities. Infrastructure, railways, ports, and towns was expanded, but always with the aim of resource export. African labourers, often underpaid and overworked, formed the foundation of this system. Their voices, largely absent from written records, tell a story of endurance beneath the heavy hand of foreign rule. In Belgium itself, the colonial enterprise remained at a polite remove. Colonial exhibitions, held in places like Tervuren, presented a sanitized vision of empire. Native villages, exotic animals, and displays of cultural artifacts. School books spoke of development and duty. Public debate was limited. For many Belgians, the Congo remained a distant curiosity, not a moral question. Yet not all were blind to the contradictions. Catholic social thinkers, socialist leaders, and a handful of liberal critics raised concerns, not only about the Congo, but about social justice more broadly. The colony became, in part, a mirror for Belgian society's own struggles with inequality, hierarchy, and modern identity. By the 1930s, the Belgian Congo was more tightly integrated into the national economy. Congolese soldiers had fought in Belgium's name during the First World War, and raw materials from the colony played a role in the war effort. But political rights remained elusive. The Congolese people, vast in number and diverse in culture, remained governed from Brussels. Their aspirations filtered through distant laws and paternalistic ideologies. Leopold II died in 1909, unloved by many in his final years, though memorialized in stone and statue. His legacy, like the colonial venture he birthed, was deeply contested. Belgium, for all its order and moderation at home, had created a colonial system marked by coercion, silence, and moral ambiguity. And so, as the 20th century wore on, Belgium remained two countries in one. The quiet European kingdom, with its careful laws and cobbled streets, and the colonial power, ruling a vast African land through distance, discipline, and economic desire. The reckoning, when it came, would be slow. but the echoes of Congo's long shadow would stretch far into Belgium's future and remain part of its quiet, complex story. As the 20th century dawned, Belgium stood on the cusp of modernity. Its cities were illuminated with gaslight, its trams ran on rails, and its industries hummed with quiet productivity. Children went to school, workers to factories, and ministers to parliament. The country was small, neutral, and self-contained, but its geography, positioned between France and Germany, placed it directly in the path of forces far larger than itself. When war came, as it inevitably did, Belgium found itself once again at the very center of conflict it had no desire to enter. In August 1914, the First World War broke across Europe. Germany, seeking a swift victory over France, launched the Schlieffen Plan, a military strategy that required moving troops through Belgium to outflank French defences. The Belgian government, bound by international treaties guaranteeing its neutrality, refused German demands for free passage. And so, war arrived on Belgium's doorstep. The German invasion was swift and overwhelming. Liège, fortified and stubborn, resisted longer than expected, but was eventually overwhelmed. Town after town fell: Namur, Dinant, Louvain. The violence was not confined to the battlefield. In an attempt to deter resistance, German forces carried out harsh reprisals against civilians. Entire villages were destroyed, hostages taken, and hundreds executed. The burning of Louvain's university library, with its irreplaceable medieval manuscripts, shocked the world and became a symbol of cultural loss. King Albert I, dignified and resolute, led the Belgian army in a valiant, if ultimately limited, resistance. The Belgian forces fell back to a narrow strip of territory along the Yser River in Flanders. There, in muddy trenches and sodden fields, they held the line for the remainder of the war. The town of Ypres, already historic, became a name etched in sorrow. The battles fought around it. First Ypres, Second Ypres, and the infamous Third Ypres, or Passchendaele, became synonymous with mud, shellfire, and human cost. Civilians in the occupied zones endured 4 long years under German control. Food shortages, forced labour, and curfews became part of daily life. Yet amidst the hardship, quiet resistance flourished. Newspapers were printed in secret, escape lines organised, and symbols of national pride maintained in private and subtle ways. The church, schools, and families became refugees of continuity in a world turned upside down. At war's end in 1918, Belgium lay scarred. Its western front was a landscape of craters and bones. Towns and villages had been reduced to rubble. Thousands of lives had been lost, not just in combat, but in the attrition of daily endurance. The Treaty of Versailles recognized Belgium's suffering, granting it small territorial gains and a seat at the peace table. The country also received mandates over Rwanda and Burundi, further expanding its colonial responsibilities in Africa. The interwar years brought a cautious return to normality. Towns were rebuilt in brick and stone. Cemeteries were laid out with quiet reverence. Monuments rose, not triumphal, but solemn. "Lest we forget" became a national refrain. Economically, Belgium faced challenges: debt, unemployment, and the shifting dynamics of global trade. Politically, tensions lingered. The linguistic divide between Dutch and French speakers grew more pronounced, and workers' movements pressed for greater rights and representation. Then, in 1940, came another storm. Once again, Germany invaded Belgium, this time under Hitler's command. The Second World War began with grim familiarity. The Wehrmacht bypassed French defences through the Ardennes and moved rapidly. Within weeks, Belgian resistance collapsed. King Leopold III, unlike his predecessor, chose to surrender and remain in Belgium, a decision that sparked deep political controversy and long-lasting debate. The occupation that followed was systematic. German authorities governed through military and civil offices. Belgian Jews were subject to discriminatory laws, and from 1942, deportations to concentration camps began. Resistance, though more fragmented than in 1914, nonetheless grew. Underground newspapers, sabotage, and clandestine networks operated throughout the country. In the Ardennes, partisans moved silently through forests, while in cities, brave individuals sheltered fugitives and passed messages beneath watchful eyes. The end of occupation came gradually. Allied forces landed in Normandy in 1944 and advanced steadily. Brussels was liberated in September of that year, followed by Antwerp. Yet the war was not over. In the winter of 1944-45, Germany launched a final offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a fierce, desperate attempt to split Allied forces, and it brought destruction once more to Belgian soil. Towns like Bastogne became sites of intense combat. The cold was bitter, the losses heavy, but the offensive failed, and Germany's defeat followed months later. In the aftermath, Belgium faced not just physical rebuilding, but questions of memory and meaning. King Leopold's wartime conduct led to a political crisis. After much debate, he abdicated in 1951, and his son Baudouin ascended the throne. The monarchy endured, though its authority was now more symbolic than political. The war left deep marks on the landscape, in the collective memory, and within the national psyche. Names like Ypres, Bastogne, and Louvain carried a quiet gravity. Schoolchildren learned them in hushed classrooms. Families visited war graves, their white stones lined in orderly rows. And yet, life resumed. Slowly, steadily, Belgium turned once more to the business of living. The post-war period brought renewal. Homes were repaired, industries reopened, trains ran again. Belgium joined the United Nations, and later the beginnings of European integration. Peace, though never taken for granted, became the background hum of life once more. But the memory of war remained, carried not in parades or proclamations, but in quieter ways. In the silence at Menin Gate, in the weathered monuments in village squares, in the stories told over coffee, and in the ones left untold. The end of the Second World War left Belgium, like much of Europe, physically battered and psychologically worn. Cities had been shelled, railways disrupted, and families divided by occupation, resistance, and exile. Yet in the quiet aftermath, amidst rubble and repair, there emerged a shared desire for peace, for stability, and for a future less prone to rupture. In Belgium, this spirit found expression not only in rebuilding what had been lost, but in building something altogether new, a more connected Europe. Economically, the early post-war years were marked by scarcity and rationing. Food, fuel, and housing were in short supply. Yet the Belgian state, drawing upon both its administrative capacity and international aid, most notably through the Marshall Plan, was quick to act. Reconstruction was systematic. Housing schemes were launched, industrial production restored, and public services expanded. The Sillen Industrial in Wallonia regained momentum, and Flemish ports such as Antwerp resumed their roles as European gateways. Politically, Belgium entered a period of measured reform. The monarchy, shaken by the royal question surrounding Leopold III's wartime decisions, ultimately stabilized under the reign of his son Baudouin. Elected governments alternating between Christian Democrats, socialists and liberals guided policy in a careful coalition rhythm. The welfare state expanded, bringing with it healthcare, pensions and unemployment support, an effort to ensure that the social dislocations of the past would not return. Yet Belgium's most lasting contribution in these years may have been its quiet role in the shaping of European integration. Having suffered 2 world wars within a generation, many Belgians recognized that peace would not be preserved through borders alone, but through cooperation. The idea of a united Europe, once abstract, began to take tangible form. In 1951, Belgium became a founding member of the European Coal and Steel Community, a modest but meaningful initiative to pool key industrial resources among former adversaries. This body would evolve into the European Economic Community in 1957 through the Treaty of Rome, to which Belgium was again a signatory. Brussels, centrally located and diplomatically minded, soon became the unofficial capital of this new European project. International institutions were drawn to the city. The European Commission, the Council of the European Union, and eventually the European Parliament all established a presence in Brussels. Diplomatic missions, civil servants, and journalists followed, transforming parts of the city into quiet hubs of multilingual governance. Cafes near the EU quarter began to echo with the sounds of German, Italian, Dutch and French in equal measure. Belgium, without loud assertion, had placed itself at the heart of the continent's future. Domestically, the post-war decades brought significant social change. A growing economy fueled demand for labour, and Belgium, like many of its neighbours, turned to immigration. Workers arrived from Italy, Morocco, Turkey and other countries, settling in industrial cities and helping to power the post-war boom. Their presence added new textures to Belgian society, new foods, new faiths, new rhythms, and also new challenges of integration and identity. Meanwhile, old internal divides began to sharpen. The long-standing linguistic distinction between Dutch-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia became more than a cultural detail. It shaped politics, education, and public life. Flemish activists pushed for recognition of their language and identity, seeking parity with the historically dominant Francophone elites. Laws were passed to establish linguistic regions, and in time, a series of constitutional reforms began to devolve power to regional governments. The 1960s and 70s saw this process accelerate. Belgium redefined itself not as a singular nation-state, but as a federal one, recognizing its multiple linguistic communities, Flemish, French, and later German-speaking. New institutions were created: the Flemish Parliament, the Walloon Parliament, the Parliament of the Brussels Capital Region. This devolution was not dramatic or confrontational, but cautious and methodical in the Belgian style, negotiated in late-night meetings, articulated through legal documents, and enacted over years. Economically, the centre of gravity began to shift. Wallonia, once the industrial heartland, experienced decline as coal mines closed and heavy industry contracted. Flanders, with its ports, light industry, and emerging service sector, began to rise. These shifts were not without friction. Regional inequalities spurred political movements and debates over resource allocation. Yet, through it all, the country held together. Not through force, but through compromise. Belgium also began to reckon more quietly with its colonial past. In 1960, the Congo was granted independence in a rushed and tense process. Belgian officials, long accustomed to governing with distance, were ill-prepared for transition. The newly formed Republic of the Congo descended into crisis, and Belgian forces intervened, nominally for protection. The years that followed saw complex entanglements, including the secession of Katanga and the eventual rise of Mobutu's regime. In Belgium, the legacy of empire lingered, visible in museum displays, in silent statues, and in the memories of those who had lived and worked in the colony. At home, the 1980s brought new challenges: economic stagnation, rising unemployment, and public debt cast shadows over earlier prosperity. Protests occurred, sometimes over wages, sometimes over pensions, sometimes over identity, and yet the country's political culture remained grounded in consensus. Labor agreements were brokered, reforms were debated, compromises, slow but effective, were made. In the broader European context, Belgium remained a quiet but consistent advocate for integration. It hosted summits, negotiated treaties, and provided a steady hand in turbulent times. Belgian diplomats, understated and multilingual, became known for their patience and tact. The country, small and plural, became a kind of model, not for simplicity, but for coexistence. By the end of the century, Belgium had become something unique: a federal state, a constitutional monarchy, a trilingual society, and a central pillar of the European Union. Its capital hosted not only its own government, but the institutions of a broader European project. Its streets bore the layers of history: Roman ruins, medieval guild halls, Baroque churches, and modern glass towers. And in its daily life, Belgium continued much as it always had. Children walked to school along cobbled lanes. Markets opened in village squares. Trains crossed linguistic lines without ceremony. The bells of cathedrals rang out over cities old and new. The work of building Europe and of building Belgium remained unfinished, as all such works do. But in the quiet corridors of Brussels, in the classrooms of Leuven and Liège, in the kitchens of Antwerp and Namur, a slow, deliberate progress continued, not through fanfare or fire, but through the steady efforts of a people who had learned, across centuries, how to endure, to adapt, and to shape their future with care. As the 20th century turned into its final decades, Belgium found itself engaged in a transformation not of borders or empires, but of self-understanding. Beneath the steady workings of government and the calm facades of its cities, a quiet but persistent process was unfolding, a rethinking of identity. It was a matter not of flags or anthems, but of language, of region, and of what it meant to belong. Belgium had always been a patchwork, stitched together from older principalities, spoken in more than one tongue, and defined as much by local rhythms as by national ones. But by the post-war period, these distinctions had begun to assert themselves more fully. The long-standing linguistic divide between Dutch-speaking Flanders in the north and French-speaking Wallonia in the south had deep roots, reaching back to historical patterns of governance, education, and economic development. In the early years of independence, French had been the language of prestige, spoken by the ruling classes, used in law and politics, and taught in schools across the country. Dutch, though widely spoken, was often seen as provincial, its speakers marginalized in public life. But by the mid-20th century, this imbalance had begun to shift. Flemish movements, cultural, political, and social, pressed for equality, first in language rights, then in recognition, and eventually in autonomy. The 1960s brought a series of reforms that would begin to reshape Belgium from a unitary state into a federal one. The country was divided into language areas: Dutch-speaking Flanders, French-speaking Wallonia, bilingual Brussels, and a small German-speaking region in the east. Laws were passed to ensure linguistic parity in education and administration. Universities were split along linguistic lines, most notably in Leuven, where the French-speaking section moved to Louvain-la-Neuve, a newly built town to the south. These changes were not abrupt, but gradual and negotiated. Belgium's political culture, rooted in coalition and compromise, adapted itself to the new reality. Regional parliaments were created, with powers over matters such as education, culture, and local government. Over time, more responsibilities were transferred: transport, environment, and parts of economic policy, until what emerged was something distinctly Belgian, a federal state where regions and communities shared power in overlapping, often intricate ways. The regional governments, Flemish, Walloon, Brussels capital, and the German-speaking community, developed their own identities and priorities. Flanders, with its growing economy and international outlook, often emphasized efficiency, innovation, and cultural self-confidence. Wallonia, facing the legacy of industrial decline, focused on regeneration, social solidarity, and heritage. Brussels, the bilingual capital, stood as a complex meeting point, both deeply Belgian and increasingly international. Language remained a sensitive subject. Road signs, public services, and even street conversations could become symbols of broader tensions. Political parties gradually split along linguistic lines, leading to parallel organizations in the north and south. Federal elections became exercises in careful arithmetic, balancing voices, forming coalitions, and managing the quiet friction between regional interests. Yet amid these divisions, there was also continuity. Belgium did not fracture. The trains still ran from Ghent to Namur, the postal service still crossed language borders, and families still moved between regions. A shared history, a shared monarchy, and shared institutions held the fabric together, not through force, but through familiarity. The monarchy, though largely ceremonial, continued to serve as a unifying symbol. King Baudouin, who reigned from 1951 to 1993, was seen by many as a figure of dignity and constancy. His successor, King Albert II, maintained this tone, while his son, King Philippe, would inherit a country increasingly defined by its differences, but also by its shared sense of quiet perseverance. Education systems diverged, each community managing its own curriculum, but students still learned about Belgium's past. The memory of two world wars, the legacy of independence, the texture of colonial history, and the rhythm of democratic life remained part of the common story, even if told in different accents. Economically, the divergence between regions shaped political debate. Flanders, now more prosperous, sometimes questioned financial transfers to the south. Wallonia, facing higher unemployment and structural challenges, advocated for social investment and solidarity. These discussions, while occasionally heated, were carried out through the slow machinery of federalism, reforms debated, adjustments made, tensions managed. Brussels, meanwhile, remained a place apart. As the seat of the European Union and NATO, it was home to thousands of diplomats, civil servants, and international organizations. Its population grew more diverse, with newcomers speaking not only Dutch and French, but Arabic, English, Portuguese, and countless other languages. The city became a microcosm of modern Europe, multilingual, layered, and ever-changing. In this context, Belgian identity became more complex, but no less real. For some, being Belgian meant embracing multiple allegiances, to region, to language, to Europe. For others, it meant preserving local traditions, parish festivals, dialects, or culinary customs. There was no single way to be Belgian, and that perhaps was the point. It was a country defined not by uniformity, but by coexistence. The humour of the people often reflected this, wry, self-aware, and fond of understatement. Belgians joked about their politics, their weather, and their bureaucracy, but they voted, they organised, and they continued, quietly, patiently, and with a particular kind of civic discipline. By the turn of the millennium, Belgium had become one of the world's most devolved states, its regions and communities wielding considerable power, its federal government often more moderator than master. And yet it remained whole, not out of grand ideology, but out of practice, habit, and the quiet preference for order over upheaval. In schools, children recited poems in Dutch and French. On television, political debates were subtitled and interpreted. In homes, families blended languages at the dinner table. And in the rhythms of daily life, market days, church bells, football matches, there persisted a sense of shared time, even if not always of shared speech. Belgium, north and south, remained a country not easily defined, but it endured, not in spite of its complexity, but because of it. In its quiet, methodical way, it showed that identity need not be singular to be strong, and that coexistence, however complicated, could still be quietly, steadily real. In the present day, Belgium sits quietly in the heart of Europe, a modest nation by size and population, yet woven into the political, cultural, and institutional fabric of the continent. Its cities bustle, its trains run on time, and its markets open with the same measured rhythm they have kept for generations. From the sandstone facades of Bruges to the highland mist of the Ardennes, Belgium continues much as it always has, deliberate, layered, and gently intricate. To the casual visitor it may seem calm, almost subdued, yet beneath its surface lies a deeply textured society, one shaped by centuries of overlapping influences, regional particularities, and the quiet resilience of a people who have, over time, grown expert at managing complexity. Belgium today remains a federal state, comprised of 3 regions, Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels, and 3 communities, Flemish, French, and German-speaking. These structures are not mere formalities. They underpin education, culture, healthcare, and language policy. Parliamentarians meet in Brussels not only for federal matters, but for regional and community business as well. It is, at times, administratively elaborate, but it works, mostly, with the quiet insistence of habit. Politics follows a familiar pattern: coalitions, compromise, long negotiations, and careful announcements. Belgian governments, especially at the federal level, are often forged slowly. No single party can govern alone. Consensus must be built patiently and incrementally. It is a system that prioritizes stability over speed, dialogue over dominance. Economically, Belgium remains quietly robust. Flanders boasts strong export industries: chemicals, machinery, food processing, and logistics. Wallonia continues its efforts in industrial transition, with pockets of innovation in aerospace and technology. Brussels, meanwhile, is a hub of administration, diplomacy, and research, its population as multilingual as it is international. Socially, Belgium balances tradition with modernity. Its towns and villages retain old rituals, carnival processions, market days, and seasonal festivals. Church bells still mark the hours, though pews are often emptier than in decades past. Secularism has grown, gently but steadily, and the rhythms of public life now blend Catholic heritage with contemporary diversity. The country is home to over 11 million people. Most speak Dutch or French, and a small minority speak German. But English is increasingly common in offices and classrooms. Migration, both from within the EU and from further afield, has added new voices and faces to Belgian life. In cities like Antwerp, Ghent, and Liège, one hears many languages at market stalls, on trams, and in schools. Integration, though not without its challenges, continues with the quiet pragmatism typical of Belgian society. Brussels remains a capital not only of Belgium but of Europe itself. It hosts the European Commission, the Council of the European Union, and NATO, among others. Civil servants from every member state work here, filling the cafes and offices of the EU quarter. Their presence has shaped the city's rhythms, adding layers of bureaucracy, of course, but also of vibrancy and connection. In environmental matters, Belgium is gently active. Green spaces are protected. Bicycle lanes expand year by year. Public transport is widely used, and efforts to reduce emissions continue. The North Sea coast, modest but scenic, is carefully managed. The Ardennes, forested and quiet, remain a place of retreat and reflection for many. Culturally, Belgium continues to contribute quietly but consistently. Its authors, filmmakers, and musicians often find audiences both at home and abroad. Comics remain a treasured form. Tintin, born in Brussels, still peers out from bookshops. Belgian beer and chocolate are renowned, not with flash, but with quiet assurance. Cuisine, too, reflects the country's dual heritage. Waffles and fries, yes, but also complex stews, delicate pastries, and finely crafted cheeses. Belgium's past, particularly its colonial legacy, is increasingly subject to reflection. Public debates, museum exhibits, and educational initiatives have begun to address the darker chapters of history, especially the period of Leopold II's rule in the Congo. Statues have been reassessed, narratives re-examined. It is a slow, sober process, one shaped not by revolutionary fervor, but by conversation and quiet re-evaluation. And through it all, life continues. Children go to school in 2 or 3 languages. Farmers tend fields where Roman legions once marched. Commuters cross linguistic lines daily, often without comment. Mayors govern villages with centuries of history. Bells toll the hour. Belgium today is not a country of grand narratives. It is not driven by myth or monument. Instead, it is defined by the modest strength of routine, of civic habit, of patient compromise. It does not command the world's headlines, but it offers something subtler, a model of endurance, of coexistence, and of quiet belonging. From the fog-bound fields of Flanders to the cobbled streets of Namur, from the multilingual hum of Brussels to the silent forests of the Ardennes, Belgium remains what it has always been, a land between languages, between traditions, between the past and the future. And in that in-betweenness, it has found not confusion, but clarity. A quiet kind of strength, shaped not by shouting, but by listening, not by conquest, but by community, and not by singular identity, but by the enduring, gentle act of living together. That brings us gently to the end of our quiet journey through the history of Belgium. From misty tribal settlements in the Low Countries to bustling cities stitched together by commerce, from the quiet endurance under foreign crowns to the slow unfolding of regional voices, Belgium's story is not one of thunder or spectacle, but of subtle transitions, patient compromise, and lasting resilience. If you've enjoyed this gentle ramble through time, do consider liking the video and subscribing. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Wherever you are, and however your day has been, I hope you find deep rest tonight, and perhaps, in the quiet of sleep, a small sense of the enduring calm found in the gentle corners of history. Good night, and thank you for joining me